So this is a pretty tricky talk. Firstly, because it's after lunch. Luckily, lunch was good, and hopefully we've all eaten. And like in about 5-10 minutes, I'm going to need to check is everybody still awake, because the food's going to do the thing. So hopefully, I keep us awake. Also, maybe walk end to end. Maya's talking about the meta of talking, so let's walk end to end for a little bit. Testing in production, you guys kind of pulled an interesting thread here, but we do that. Okay, we're always going to do that because there's certain things that we'll only find there. What's interesting to me is how we can find things a little bit earlier than that. So that's what we're going to chat about today, and not just the technical aspects, the actual tools, because I think we all know what the tools are. We've seen all the tools, but how do we actually get this stuff to actually happen? How do we prioritize it? How do we decide it's more important than this other thing? How do we communicate to people that we're doing it? Make sure that we actually get it done. Get from where we were over there to someone over here who thinks it's actually useful in the real world, and back to our land on this side. So what this thing is supposed to do is, yes. Okay, so for today, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through a review of a recent end-to-end release that we did. Firstly, because that's going to help us wake up a little bit, it's real. Secondly, because my imaginary co-presenter over here is not imaginary, he's just invisible. His name is Benjamin. AfroLabs is full remote now, and Benjamin sits in the Netherlands, so it's a bit harder for him to be here today. In our virtual world, Benjamin also appears as just a hat. His entire body is invisible, so I think it's in character for him to be invisible here. And maybe next time I'll put a hat on a stick. So we're going to talk about people, myself and Benjamin, and then I'm going to basically give a bit of a landscape on testing, because what is E2E testing, where are we? Then I'm going to demo this thing, and then I'm going to unpack what just happened there and see how we actually got that done, and then maybe some tips for where we could start. I'm not sure how Maya would draw my talk, but it's tell you what you're going to tell, I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to take you through it, and at the end I'll tell you what I just told you, and hopefully there'll be space in your mind for those concepts. So maybe it's a diverge, 3 bullet points down, and then come back in. There's a few ups and downs, and maybe some awkwardness in the talk, so that's the emotional there. But the key message is this thing is quite cool. So there's 2 AfroLabs dev people in this space. Myself, I started a dev shop 18 years ago. I've done devy stuff at over 100 startups, including Loop, who I'm going to show you some stuff about today, where Glenn is in the audience. A couple of other people have seen what's happening there. Also done engineering, org design type stuff, whether you call that team lead or coaching at Microsoft, at Allan Gray, who's a sponsor, so I can shout them out. At Yoko, not a sponsor, I'm shout them out too. And at Sweep South, no, actually. And why do I do this stuff? It's actually incredibly hard, frustrating, because when we started, I wanted to do software right, naively, and today I want to help us keep loving creating. Like, if we could love creating, enjoy what we do, everything flows from that. On the other hand is Benjamin. He's got a history in logistics dev. He was the main dev on the Loop app, the first version of it, which is now written in Kotlin. And he's also an indie game dev. And why he does his stuff is largely because magic is fun. He's actually a trained magician, and he taught magic, but also making better dev experiences, as Benjamin likes to say. Like, if you're not automating all the things, what are you doing with your life? So there's Benjamin, and there's me. And then there's testing, right? This is not a talk about ancient Egypt, even though I have 2 pyramids up here. But I'd like to start on this pyramid over here, because we often don't think about this one outside of startup business lectures, which is this idea that a product is the user segments, then the user needs, then we've actually got the functionality layer, and then once you've got functionality, it needs to be reliable and usable and ultimately enjoyable. And working with a lot of startups, we try to figure out an MVP, which is this thin slice. When we talk about testing, most of what we're talking about is at the functional layer. In terms of automated testing, that's what I'm going to talk about today. But testing all of those other layers is super duper important, and probably the stuff below the line, below that waterline, it's probably the most important things when you're an early stage startup. But then as you start to scale up, making sure that it works every time, that it works and that it works every time becomes more important. So we look into this functional layer here, where you see a bit more of the traditional testing pyramid. Can I just, like, show of hands in the audience, who has seen this thing before? 1, 2, 3, like 20%, 30%. Either the others are asleep or it's new. So I'm going to assume it's newish. So the pyramid is bigger on the bottom and it's smaller on the top. Okay. I also teach 7 to 17-year-olds. Sometimes you need to say obvious things. So it's bigger on the bottom because there's a lot more on the bottom. So in this idea, there's a lot more unit tests. There are fewer component tests. There are fewer integration tests. There is less and less UI and API testing. And then hopefully there's very little manual and exploratory tests. So this is also imaginary and idealized. That pyramid might look like South Africa's Gini coefficient, kind of anemic on the top and giant on the bottom. Or it might look like a wine glass, hourglass bell curve of some European countries, big and small. We don't know where it is, really, but it's idealized like that because the stuff on the top is painful and slow. So we don't want to do a lot of that. And then the next stuff is slower, all the way down to unit tests, which are super fast and super useful because when they break, you know exactly where you need to look to fix them. So the next question for waking up the audience is, anyone here got end-to-end tests-ish running in their place of work? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, similar. So where in this stack does an end-to-end sit? Because it doesn't actually say end-to-end on there. That's just a guess from the wake-up crowd. Like number 2. Yeah, kind of about-ish there, right? So UI and API testing can be at the component level, but then just before we give it to the manual and exploratory testing layer, we kind of put it all together. And it's not, so what end-to-end testing is not, is unit testing. So we're not testing our code at the code level. It's also not complete. If you were to try to be complete in an end-to-end test, you would go completely nuts. It's also not particularly easy, because it's not something we do very often. And it's also not a non-technical task. So sometimes people will try to give end-to-end testing to non-technical people because, like, that's someone else's domain and maybe they can get it done because there's this course. What it is even though it's not complete, it's a verification that it all still works together. When you put it all together, does it work? It also saves time before a human looks at it. Now, humans are horrible, right? They're difficult to schedule if anyone's tried to schedule a meeting, right? You got to get people in a room. That's difficult. It's difficult to get people to do things. You need to put something on their task list. It needs to become the first thing on their task list, and they need to do it. So that thing, we don't want to do too much. So if we can get a robot to do it, robots exist on demand, and they're really great, so we save time before a human looks at it. Whether that's a human in another team, or a customer, or a product person who's having a look at it, and this saves us, firstly, the pain and the anguish of someone looking at it and being like, oh, this is broken. And you'd be like, oh, right, yeah, let me just fix that. That just cycle, I don't know. How long does that take in your place of work, Maya? That just cycle? Yeah, somewhere between 2 hours and 2 weeks, probably averaging, like in a goodish place, 3 to 5 days, because someone gets the work, they do the work, it comes back. Oh, yeah, I just fixed it. All right, now we've had it a whole week because I just had, I forgot to change that setting. That was annoying. So it's got much faster feedback than giving it to humans because I can do it. I can, within an hour or so, even if it's a really slow end-to-end test, have that feedback in an hour or so rather than a couple of days. And the idea is that we want to check that chickens go in and pies come out, right? Has anybody seen Chicken Run? The most famous quote from Chicken Run is, but I don't want to be a pie. I don't like gravy. This happens just after they're like, what does this machine do? And they don't say, this machine has a thermometer on the side, it's got a heater in the middle, it's got a conveyor belt, it's got a chicken chopper, it's got a this, it's got a that. It says, chickens go in and pies come out, right? That's like the specification level of an integration test, There are other tests to check that the thermometer and the conveyors work. That's all the unit testing. But like, do pies actually come out? And sorry, I see that I mistyped it. It's PR come out, and they should really not come out. Maybe that's the sound of a chicken. Also Chicken Run is a movie about a machine that's running reliably, turning chickens into pies, and then what happens? Can anybody remember the plot of the movie? Anybody? The chickens revolt, and they destroy the damn pie-making machine, and it stops making pies, right? Sometimes a perfectly good pie-making machine breaks for absolutely no reason that we can understand, and it's really frustrating. And that might be that someone has updated a library, or that something doesn't actually work that way anymore because some well-meaning person put it in dev notes for like 5 years and it's been deprecated 3 years ago, but you didn't notice, and now pies are not coming out anymore. And then you ask someone to test it and they're like, oh yeah, okay, let me just update those deps. That 4-letter word just again. So there's a whole lot of spaces we could test, as I was mentioning, and I want to land kind of where end-to-end testing sits. I tend to try to build a radar between different teams so we can share and compare our practices. And when we talk about testing, it would be like, let's have a talk about coding, right? It's parfait. Like, there's layers all the way down. Where are we? What do we want to talk about? Jelly? Do we want to talk about like the pastry or like the layering of the pastry? So we need to know where we are in the map. Here, we take the layers of the pyramid and put them across. And then in different teams, we can say, okay, yeah, we use chromatic, and we're using Mixpanel for our measurements when we get to there. But it goes all the way from how do we communicate our tests to how do we code and how do we interface and what are the other qualities. And the reason this is interesting is this radar is designed for humans to make sense of this huge area that we are testing. And it maps the context so we can coordinate with others and learn and contribute. And I want to say a lot more about that because Maya and I were right at the beginning of a really interesting conversation about this at dinner last night. So I'm just going to leave it with that's super interesting. The question for me is, like, where and how would it work for you to do something like this and understand where you're testing? I'll leave that for you to maybe go back and think how you do it. If you're in a big company, you can do it if there is a community. For smaller companies, you need to find a community. Like a GDG event, you can go chat about it at the coffee table. That's something we're also trying to create over at AfroLabs, so give us a shout and we'll happily like show you other people's ones and connect you to other people and maybe even take some of someone's money if we could ever figure out a business model for it to like stitch you together into the XLabs community. So, as I promised, I will show. And I'm just going to do my time check here quickly with the man of the moment. Cool. So, now the mystical power of our Alt-Tab and the mystical power of the internet. So what I promised was a review, right? Benjamin's over in the Netherlands, and one of the things that's important is that things...
This video demonstrates how you can run these tests using GitHub Actions.
So this is pulling up GitHub Actions from the Netherlands, clicking some buttons and showing some people in South Africa how this works so that you can hand it across without having to schedule a meeting, but with the ability to actually put this into a Slack channel that everybody can see how this works, and we want to run some behave tests. Don't worry, I'll explain a bit of this in a bit.
Tests are running. You can preview the results here.
So it starts to do a lot of cool robot work, which we would normally, maybe, hopefully run the tests on our machine before we do it. But as you see how long these sorts of things take, we tend not to do them on our own local machines. In any end-to-end test, it's end-to-end. So it's this side to this side, and it's sort of under the carpet to the roof. We're not quite as, in this specific review, we're not quite as advanced as someone like Maya's World, where they spell up a whole new environment for the end-to-end test and start from the day dot. But the idea is, like, you start it as if you were doing a fresh deploy. You bring the tech stack up all the way, and then we get to the actual meat and potatoes of the thing where we're actually going to test the behavior from the first action, all that would be a system event, all the way to the last action. That's an interesting system event. So Benjamin skipped some boring parts of the video, but this one takes a little bit longer. I'm just watching the 33 second counter. You got to remember, though, that because this can run in an action, no one's watching it most of the time. So all of these tiny little microseconds are disappearing away. You can run the automatic checks that you wouldn't normally run. And we're saving this time here. And someone can watch this review and skip through the the thing, and no one's sitting awkwardly waiting for this review to run when we do it inside of a team and in our context. And then we get to our magic moment once all these depths are checked and we hop into behave. So show of hands in the audience, anybody played with behavior-driven development or BDD? Okay. Mava, that's cheating. So the idea is that we speak in plain English. Now, I'm going to break this down in a later slide, but I say given an order, when the order is created and logged in on the DOS and the order exists, then the order should exist. We all understood those words. You didn't understand most of the things that happened before that, right? Unless you were deep in the domain context, which is probably half of the room at least. But the idea is that when we actually get to the really interesting part of the test, we can run it
Hi, I would like to show you how the app and the DOS work together to complete an order automatically.
If you were doing it on your own machine, you'd get a bit more interaction out of it. So you're going to pull up, effectively, this is the operations center. Have a look at what's going to happen, create an order, assign that order to a driver.
This part of the test can take a while, and I'll skip ahead to when it's near completion.
So even
To test the app, we use Firebase Test Lab. Test Lab unfortunately does not allow us to preview the test in real time and requires us to view it once it is complete.
Anybody using Test Lab? 3. Okay, great. I will get to tell you some wonderful things a bit later.
Now that the test is complete, Firebase Test Lab prompts us to reload the page to view the results. Test Lab captures information about your app that includes the actions that's performed during test, screenshots of those actions, a video, and performance metrics throughout the lifetime of the app.
So you'd think this video was cool, but actually the performance tab is far cooler. Because it's like YouTube with the subtitles on the right, where you can actually click down through what people have been doing. I think this is when I hand back to Benjamin. Not in this one. So if you can see the events down the right, those are the events that the test was actually running. And if you wanted to see what happened at the various points, you can actually click back and forth there, which is super cool because watching the whole video can take a while. And that's a robo-test part of Firebase Test Lab, which if you remember one thing from what I'm talking about today, it's probably that, because that's super interesting and super easy, really. Robo-test, if you give it 0 configuration, we'll just click on random stuff in your app for a while and see what breaks and give you a test result back. Does the clicker still work? Yes. Okay, so those were the videos. So what was actually going on there? As I promised, I wanted to kind of go with the confusion test, the talk approach. So like I showed you some interesting stuff. Maybe it stimulated your brain. So the problem domain of Loop is last mile delivery. So Kim, who's the founder of Loop, was inspired by this traveling salesman problem while she was studying and had the insight that people were really not doing stuff well in the market, and started out with a delivery system that now, probably the one that we all would be familiar with is Checker 6060. All of those deliveries run on Loop Rails on the delivery side. So the driver app is what you just saw automatically tested there. That's the thing that every driver is using for 6060. And DOS, so it runs on DOS and Android. But DOS is a pun, because we couldn't avoid it. When we saw that a dispatch operating system could be called DOS, we have the DOS, and then we have the Android side of the application. And it's used, as the slide gives you the teaser on, by Nando's, Checker 6060, Serviest, and watch this space coming soon. I can't tell you everybody, because we're not allowed to say everything. What happens in the solution domain? Lots of Google Cloud for the DOS and the API stuff, Firebase, Firestore, App Engine, in the compute and functions coming through, BigQuery and Data Studio to get the answers out. And in Android, there's also, as with most companies, a series of apps. The first one was like native Java, then got rewritten in Kotlin, and now Flutter for the new generation work. Lots and lots of locations, because you can understand that's super important. And initially we were building for just one device, and now there's multiples. So how did we actually get to testing? Now this is kind of another exercise for my sleepy audience, and I am noticing that it is sleepy o'clock. I won't point at anyone in particular. But so what happens when we combine humans and technology? Just a big mess, yeah? Anybody else? Robots. Very good. I hadn't thought about that one. Pardon? Solutions, yeah? So we got mess, we got robots, we got solutions. Hopefully not a solution of human digested into like a flask. And that's maybe what the robots want. False expectations, yeah. So I often describe my life as helping humanity and technology work, play, and dance together. One core insight that technology would not exist without humans. And philosophically, the quintessential definition of a human is something that uses technology, right? So making and using technology pretty much defines us as humans, whether that's language or fire or an Android device or something more exotic. That's really what's it about. And so we need to coexist, and figuring out patterns for how we coexist is actually pretty interesting. We figured out fire before, right? Fireplaces work quite well. We know how to put fire inside a house and not have the house burn down. We don't know so well always how to put Android inside of a company and not have that company burn down, but we'll figure that out over time. So one of those fireplacey type of things that I end up doing quite a lot of is organization and how do we communicate. So I want to touch on 3 things that are like fireplaces for organizations, which is story maps, BDD, and something very old-fashioned which you may have heard of called RACI. So a story map is basically a way that many user experience design folks, how we do? Yeah? Pardon? 8 minutes left? Cool. Sweet. So you'll often see this in product design, not so often in test design. I love it in test design for end-to-end because we can draw out our whole end-to-end from dispatch through delivery through check, and how are we going to make that visible to the user. And then what a story map does is it says, let's put a line across there. They're very faint gray lines, and say, look, for our first release, we just wanted Firebase Test Lab automated and that the driver scripts through. Everything else is done manually, right? That's a first release. And Firebase Test Lab to do that's super easy, right? You can record that and be done in like an hour and have an automated test, which would be pretty boring for everybody else in the organization and not solve too many problems, but it solves yours. And if you put it into a story map, people can see where you're going and why it's useful. And it's not some arbitrary side effect that's lying around. So it performs this job of a coordination flight level for outsiders. And as you get into way more exotic things like, I want to do something better on automating order dispatching in the beginning, and then I want that to be more resistant, that quickly becomes a very outsider concept. People don't know what you're doing anymore. But if you can point to a map and a story map, then at least you can kind of understand what other people are doing. And when someone in another team is doing something at a similar stage, you can be like, oh, I get it, you're doing something super similar. And that's kind of how things work together, and it doesn't all explode. BDD is another one like that. I think it doesn't serve itself well by having an acronym, but it's basically describe the behavior. So a driver does an order. So given an order and we're logged in, when the order is created, then the order exists. Given an app driver, when the order is assigned to the driver and the driver progresses through the order, then the order is no longer visible, like it's in the batch list because it's been done. Those are kind of the high level things that you can agree in the beginning. And that firstly provides like a work plan. You're like, I'm going to spend a week doing line 27. Right? I want to like do the automated setup part. Or maybe it's going to take me my first 3 days to do line 31 because I need to new up a new driver. And then I'm going to spend another 4 days on that because I need to improve it. But again, it's a useful map. And that language goes all the way into the code. And you don't have to translate it into coder speak and back into product person speak and back into coder speak. And all that translation and hand waving erodes a lot of trust. You can use those same words. You can go back and be like, those are the same words we used. Let's change those words. So it's a really great communication tool. And then lastly, we often don't pay attention to how the people are actually connected in an organization. And I find that a really old-fashioned tool called RACI, which is normally only used in like enterprise design, but it's saying who's responsible, who and how are we accountable, who and how do we consult, and who and how do we inform. And the and how is important because I like to add tools in here. Like it could be a Slack channel. It could be a Geekbot that checks in on you daily. It could be GitHub that runs things. But paying attention to each of these things to say, how are the tests, who's going to be responsible? Like Benjamin does the work, it says up there, just in tiny words because you're not supposed to read it. Under accountable, David and Benjamin drive the loops of consult and inform. Before we start the work, let's go and ask Nadine and Richard and Seba what's happening, like do these things make sense? Then when we're done, we're just going to push it out into the channel and anyone who wants to consume it can do it. And then we might do, then we'll do a video and specific demos as needed. In terms of the tech, another trifecta, GitHub Actions, which we looked at earlier in the demos, and then Behave, and then Firebase Test Lab. In terms of GitHub, the cool things about GitHub is really the coolest thing is that you don't have to remember much. And if you work across startups like me, like, how did we do this there? You can log into like a consistent place and be like, oh, there's a button in the top that says run this workflow. The results can all go into one place, so I don't have to remember where did I put screenshots and where did that stuff happen. And whether you're working across startups or across weeks, we forget things. We are humans. Technology does not. It's really good at that. So use it for what it's good for. And it also provides an objective history of like, oh, it was working last week. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. Okay, let's go and see. Yes, it was. Great. No, it actually wasn't. And this is where like writing out the BDD can also really help. Those step definitions, giving you a sense of progress and helping you zoom back out again. You know, that process of moving to different flight levels when communicating with your team. So it starts at the line 27 through line 34, and the details aren't super important, but like line 27 is here, line 34 is here, but line 27 is somewhere up there as it's written, and it goes all the way down into the test code, into the system under test, and actually ends up in the stuff at the bottom. And that zoom in and out, being able to go all the way to the top level and communicate well, really helps. And then Firebase Test Lab. I should probably give a 2-hour talk on Firebase Test Lab because Firebase Test Lab is amazing and terrible, right? As with all powerful things. The thing that's amazing about it is if you want to start with some Android automation, it's the laziest damn thing you can do. It's really easy to start with, and you get like cool bang shoot results that you can show people we've done stuff. So if you want a cool first iteration to start with and you have an Android app that's native or Flutterish, but Flutter is not so good with, but effectively Robo just explores your app. And you know, we always dreamed about something that would do that, and you plug a thing in, turn it on, and it does the work for you. It's amazing. And then it records a video and shows you a performance graph of your app and shows you a memory graph of your app, and you can click to the place where the performance was high and see that, oh, I was showing this random widget there and that was interesting. Wow. I mean, it's mind-blowing, and yeah, it's just cool. So how can you get started? So I've talked about those 2 dimensions. At AfroLabs, we talk about a whole hexagon for a product. You've got a product, you've got your organization, you've got your collectives, you've got your individual growth, you've got your infrastructure, and then you've actually got your code base. So the infrastructure and the code base is the technology side. The comms and planning is like your org, slightly across to your product, but most of your org. In the comms and planning, dream big, but start small. They like what I said. It's a pleasure. I just said comms. So a story map and choose a first release. If you don't know where to start, maybe listen and do a Firebase Test Lab or do a first It Works test. In the BDD, think about a first given, when then given. I look at the screen. When I load my home web page, I can see the word, my company's brand name. And then in terms of the race, start small. Pick one accountability buddy, someone who's going to care when you do this, because this is emotional stuff we do. We humans, we ride on a sea of emotions, just like our technology rides on a sea of code. Start small. Pick your audience. Who am I going to tell when it works? And that can generally be the Slack channel where you talk about dev and tell them I'm going to do it. Find your accountability buddy and tell them, and don't consult too much. because my gosh, whataboutism, and people will give you a million solutions, and when you're trying to do something small, just pick something and get it done. This is a bullet slide because I would have forgotten some of these cool points. But technology, on the other hand, is the easy part, or at least the fun bit. If you're just starting out, I would suggest having a look over at Test Automation University. If you're really diligent, do all of the courses. If you're not, click through them and just look at the practices. It's like, oh, I want to do Python automation. Tick, tick, tick. Okay, I can see those things. I can see those tools. They've got awesome free courses and a whole bunch of things. Their ulterior motive, just because everyone wonders what it is they sell a pretty cool visual testing tool that like reads what's on the page. So halfway through each course, you'll find their course. There's one on the Test Automation Use product, which you don't have to use. But then the most important thing, which we learned from and my friend Toya taught me about that, the InfoSec community, so hackers and people who try to pretend to not be hackers and call themselves InfoSec, have this wonderful saying, which is F around and find out. The more you want to find out, the more you need to F around. And if you need to find out what's going to work, you need to F around a really large amount. So also don't say that you're not effing around. Don't say that this test tool is going to work for you. Say like, we want to test a whole bunch of them. I want to play with them. I want to find what's really going to work, because that's the way to pick a tool, not based on some sort of enterprise matrix. Also, to wrap up this talk, afrolabs, we can help over coffee. Reach out to us. Also Loop. Amazing people are hiring. So if you kind of like that problem domain and the solution domain, then look up their website and run across there. That was just a quick review of an actual release. So I wanted to be really real and not super theoretical here. So Benjamin and myself spend a week, a month actually trying to kick that can down the road. That's where he got to. You saw a demo of it. I tried to help you understand what just happened there, how we actually got it done organizationally and technologically, and finally, maybe giving you a clue where to start. This was a specific look in how, as AfroLabs, we helped do the end-to-end test automation at Loop. We looked at Google Cloud, all the way through the webby stuff, or the Android stuff, back up to web, because we actually have to check the results worked in web. I was David, and that was Benjamin.